This podcast is brought to you by the Early Career Club, a private online community for prospect research professionals building their careers. Grow your prospect research knowledge and skills through content, discussions, and activities. Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. This interview is part of the Career Curious series. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Charity Tubilato, Lara Arlan-Wier, and Sandra Kent about telecommuting.
Hello, Charity, Lara, and Sandra. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites. I'm really excited to talk with all of you today about telecommuting. But first, I'm going to ask you to each introduce yourself. Charity, will you start?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Charity Tubilato. I am the National Director of Prospect Research for an organization called City Year, and I currently work remotely.
Hello, I'm Lara Arlan-Wier, and I previously telecommuted for the Juilliard School and most recently for UNICEF USA for a brief time.
Hi, I'm Sandra Kent, and I am currently with Northern Michigan University in the Prospect Research and Biographical Update Department, but I teleworked from Michigan Technological University for 4 years.
Wonderful. So we have a wealth of telecommuting experience here today, and I'm kind of curious, first question, I'm wondering how that telecommuting position came about. Did you want to go ahead and start, Sandra?
Sure. My husband got a job 2.5 hours away in Marquette. And so we were trying to figure out what we were going to do. I was living in Hancock, Michigan, northern way up, and we didn't know what we were going to do. And I was trying to think about how we're going to do this. I ended up in the elevator with the vice president of development. And he said, well, I think I have a solution to your problem. You just need to divorce him. And I said, no, that's not possible. But actually, it's interesting that you asked about that because somebody said to me, what about teleworking? And he said, oh, no, maybe that would work. And so I was able to get the buy-in from way up. And so that made it possible for me.
That's a great story. It adds a whole new dimension to the elevator speech. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Lara, how about you? How did you get into telecommuting?
So when I was at the Juilliard School, my wife got a job across country. So we were in New York City and she got a job in Portland, Oregon. So I presented the idea and Juilliard, they approved it. And it was the first remote telecommuting position they'd ever had. So it was a new experience for them and new experience for me, but I signed a telecommuting contract. And it worked out really well. We planned for me to work full-time through the end of the summer. And then I continued to work part-time working on specific projects. So it ended up working really well.
So when you say you presented it, what does that mean? What was that like?
Well, I presented it first to my supervisor and then our vice president. Then my supervisor presented it to HR, the head of HR. There was some conversation, some back and forth, like, what does this mean? Typical telecommuting questions came up, which we worked through, and it was approved.
Nice. And Charity, how about you? How did you fall into telecommuting?
So I work for City Year headquarters, which is based out of Boston, Massachusetts, and I was working there for about 3 years when my husband got into business school in Philadelphia. And so we ended up needing to move there. And what's interesting about our team is that we got a new head of the department who actually works out of New York. So he was the first person on our team to be technically remote. And so I was the second person. And because our organization is national, we support 28 sites across the country. So there are quite a few of us who are telecommuting. And so I was not necessarily the trailblazer in the organization, but it was sort of the early phase of more and more of us working from across the country.
I'm sensing a theme. It's the spouses. Spouses are putting this into action, sort of indirectly. That's wild. My story is kind of the same. I started working independently because I was dating my husband and he's retired and wanted to travel a lot. So that same kind of pressure, like I needed more flexible time, flexible geography. Now that you're all telecommuting or have, how does it work with the manager? You know, it's a fear I hear about a lot. Like, I won't be able to manage you if I can't see you. So, like, how does that reporting go back and forth? Did you want to give that a start, Sandra?
Sure. I actually had two different bosses during the time. My original boss, I'd already been on staff for 6 years. And so I had a lot of credibility about my work. I determined when I started doing this that once a month I would attend the staff meetings on location so that I could stay connected. That first year, I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with an average of 200 plus inches of snow. And so that first November, December, of course, there was a blizzard the day I drove up. And so I quickly changed that so that I would only do it during not blizzard days. So I would call in for the staff meeting so that I could still have input. I could still hear what was going on. My boss would come down once a quarter and take me to lunch, and we'd kind of discuss some things. So they were very willing to work. And then she retired and someone else came in, and it was a little bit different. I didn't have as much input. We were doing weekly meetings, but then they started getting canceled. And so then there was less and less of that. It was more of a disconnect. And so any communication that I had really had to come from me. So I would contact the development officers about any questions, just so that I could keep that hands-on communication with them.
Yeah, so communication is a challenge when you're not face-to-face and other people are. Lara, did you want to share how you've been managed?
Yeah, I had a similar experience, especially at Juilliard, where the rest of the staff was on site and I was pretty much the only one not there. So it was my responsibility to check in. I think I started with I kept up with my weekly check-in with my supervisor. And then I reached out to the frontline fundraisers as needed as I was working on projects with them. Like Sandra, yeah, I had credibility in the organization already. I had been working for the organization. I had a good relationship with our vice president and the rest of the team, so they could trust me. They had an idea of what my productivity was when I left, so they knew what to expect, and I obviously stayed up with that. I didn't necessarily have specific metrics that I remember. When I was working remotely with UNICEF, there was, an expectation, a certain number of profiles that would be accomplished, throughout the week.
That's what I love about profiles. They're so concrete.
Right.
They're either done or not.
That's the benefit of, especially if there's, a meeting scheduled or some deadline that it has to be done by, then, you send it.
Well, Charity, what's been your experience being managed remotely?
Sure. And what's interesting, too, is that I manage a team remotely. So my team of 2 researchers are based out of Boston. My current manager right now is based out of Los Angeles. And so we set up numerous ways to be able to connect officially and unofficially. So we have one-on-ones every week, and that's over WebEx. We use video. And then we have monthly department meetings where everyone also calls in over WebEx, because now at this point, I think about 40% of our team is working remotely. So it is a different environment when you're not the only person on the phone or the only person on the video. I think there's a better threshold. So you're not feeling alone in terms of calling in and everyone else is in the room. So we have WebEx for official communication and meetings. And then we use Skype for when we need to do that drop-in, or that, I would say, the water cooler chatting, where you just want to kind of ask a quick question or do something really informal. We definitely like to use Skype for that. And then I would say the key in terms of showing presence and having as much transparency and accountability with communication is being upfront about what your communication style is. How often do you expect either your direct report or your manager to communicate? How fast do you want people to respond? And so I typically tell my direct reports that, if you really want me to respond right away, just send me a text on my work cell phone. if it's something that you feel like you want me to respond within the day, email me, or if you want to get a direct response, then call me. So we have informal protocols where we set up expectations in terms of the way that we want to communicate. In terms of performance metrics, the team has official performance metrics, very similar sounding around the number of deliverables, customer service, feedback. We use a net promoter score to get a sense of how our frontline fundraisers are they satisfied or not with our responsiveness, with the quality of our research. And I think that's something we had to set up being a national organization. And so it fit in really well with being able to work remotely. But also very similarly, I had demonstrated in person that I was a reliable, generally responsible, competent employee. So I think that also is definitely a good foundation to have. I think it would have been much harder, and I've seen it be much harder at my organization when you start as a telecommuter versus someone who has familiarity with the organization.
Wow, really good insight. That is so much fun that you're managing a team remotely as well. That's great. You know, I asked you how you're being managed by others, but how do you manage yourself? Like when you're at home, are there distractions? Are you wearing pajamas every single day? Charity, why don't you go ahead and start with that?
That's funny. I think that is the most frequent question I get as someone who works from home. And I think the funny or general sort of mainstream thinking is that you get distracted so you might not be as productive. And so what I find is actually I work too much. And so I've created ways to be able to draw lines between the workday and sort of personal time so that they're not blurring. So one fun thing I like to do when it feels like a really hectic week is we have a uniform at our organization. And so one piece of it is a vest. And so when I feel like it's going to be one of those weeks where I might end up working too much or blurring lines between work and personal time, I usually put on the vest as sort of like a signal. I put on the vest, sit at my desk, have my coffee as sort of, this is the work time. And I think the most challenging part is ending the work time and figuring out whether or not, what your consistent hours would be. So I think having something like that is really useful. Otherwise, it's really just what I would do to manage my time if I were working from an office. That's been my experience with the challenge is working too much and really having a set expectations around work-life balance.
Not the response I thought I'd hear. How about you, Sandra?
You know what? I determined when I started doing this that I would get up, I would exercise, I'd take my shower, do my hair, and then I would get ready for work. And I dressed casually, but I vowed never to wear pajamas. And I knew that they were going to ask. And so I knew I wanted to be able to say, no, I am not doing that. And so I just determined that's how I was going to do it. The only distraction I had was my cats loved when I was in conference calls, and they would like to be right there beside me and they'd be meowing. And
that's a challenge.
Yes, I didn't wear makeup, but I actually did try to dress so that I could reflect being a professional.
It's almost a costume or a uniform.
Exactly.
How about you, Lara? Did you have any challenges managing yourself at home?
You mentioned the cats, and one of the benefits of moving from New York City is that I got a door on my study, so I can close it and the cats stay on the other side. I guess the work demands a certain time frame and a certain energy to it, so I find that I stay focused on the work. Because if you start doing other things around the house, you get pulled in there and you're like, oh, wait, hours and hours have passed. But yeah, I think it's easy. I mean, what I've found is just staying in the work. And like you, Sandra, getting up, getting dressed, putting on that quote unquote uniform of your business clothes, it definitely puts you in the mindset, especially if you're having WebEx or Zoom conference calls. You can't really wear your pajamas and be taken seriously as a professional.
That's great. Yeah, I found that when I first started working from home, it was actually easier to be less distracted because colleagues didn't come in and bother me, and I wasn't pulled into other people's offices in conversations, and I had more thought time. And I find for research, I really need to focus. I guess that this is a little more of a fun question. I'm just wondering, like, what is the best thing about working home? Do you have any, fun story or favorite thing? Did you want to start with that, Lara?
A favorite thing about working from home? Well, one of my favorite things is not having a commute. Like when I lived in New York, that was definitely a investment during the day. So it's really nice to finish my workday and go pick up the kids at daycare or start, personal time, whatever that may be. So that's one thing I really appreciate, being able to stop work and do the next thing.
It is a definite benefit. There's like hours more time. How about you, Sandra? What was your favorite part about telecommuting?
When there's a blizzard or 20 inches of snow on the ground, and my commute was, 30 seconds. And unfortunately, I did kind of brag about it. But the most fun was that the university got shut down because of a snow day, and I got to have a snow day while I was at home. So I thought that was pretty fun.
That's awesome. What about you, Charity? What's your favorite thing?
I guess telecommuting would be up there. I think one of my favorite things is being able to either take calls if they're not over WebEx or take a break by walking my dog. I feel like it's a great way to reset, a great way to reflect, especially if you had a really intense morning on conference calls or even with research, that it's just a nice thing to do to step out, even if it's for just 2 minutes and walk the dog and be outside. I think that's my favorite thing.
It's one of my favorite things, too, that I can take a break and have physical activity, because I feel like it does charge the brain. And that's more difficult in an office environment. It depends. There's too many variables there, and you don't want to be sweating and in a suit and things like that. But it really does help the brain think better. It's amazing. Or solve a problem. And then there's the whole point of, if you don't have to commute for an hour in the morning and an hour at night, now you have time for exercise. Okay. So we've heard the best. What's the worst? What are some of the pitfalls? Did you want to start with that, Sandra?
I guess the pitfall was when we got new management and they didn't know me. And so they made the decision that I would need to move back up to Houghton and be on campus. How was I going to do that? And so the hard part was they were just so absolutely unrealistic about it. And they really treated me well because they didn't want to lose me, but I couldn't do that. I mean, how do you do that? I said, well, are you going to pay for my rent? They laughed. No. So that was really difficult because I loved my job. I'd been in prospect research for 10 years and to have that, happen. And yeah, that was really tough. They started making decisions without me. If I wasn't there and they were, they started making other things happen. And then they'd say, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you. I had to always ask, all right, so anything new that I might need to know? And so that was tough. Yeah, that made it tough.
Do you think that was because maybe a couple of people were resistant to building rapport with you virtually?
I think they just forgot about me. They were used to me doing work, but I think they forgot about me.
How about you, Charity? What are the pitfalls?
I would say the same thing. How can you show presence virtually? And something that we hear a lot often now that more people work remotely is out of sight, out of mind. And is that really true or not? And so how can you build presence virtually? And similar to what Sandra said, how can you be part of informal conversations to the water cooler if you're not there, going in and out of meetings if you're not there, when there are all these extra sort of side bar conversations happening? And how do you, like you said, build rapport without being there physically? And I think it is harder if you have a new manager or if you have new team members that haven't really worked with you very closely. But I do think it's easier if there are more people who are used to someone working remote, or if you have someone on part of the leadership team who works remote, because then that's usually when you see a little bit more of an effort to build rapport with people who are not in the office.
How about you, Lara?
Yeah, very similar. I find that working remotely, I do miss the water cooler conversations, especially with those frontline fundraisers, the profiles that I'm working on, just having those casual conversations here and there can sometimes be informative. It would have been nice to visit occasionally to have that experience of face to face. And similar to Sandra, there was a meeting that I ran at Juilliard, and once I was not on site, I didn't get to participate in it. So obviously I was left out of those conversations. I think I might have called in on the speaker phone, but that's very different than sitting in the room. How do you be present when you're not on site? But I think with what Charity is saying, structurally, you can make it more inclusive if the organization works that way.
It's interesting because with the startup companies or, these all virtual companies, there are a lot of tools out there like Basecamp or Slack where, there is room for casual conversation. I've become a recent convert to Slack. It's like Facebook or something where you can text. But if you're the only person remote, you're still going to end up being left out of conversations.
It takes a group commitment, I think, to use exactly what you're saying so that everybody's on the same channel.
Ha! Slack would love to hear you say that because that's what they call them, channels. That's great. Okay. Another funny question. Does anyone have, or have you experienced where people have these weird misconceptions about what you do at home all day working? Did you want to start with that, Charity?
Sure. I have a really funny one, especially when I first started, because I would the best way to reach me is either by text or Skype or back then we were using GChat, just because if I'm on a conference call, I might not answer you if you call me. And so my boss used to joke that I was a spy because every time he called, I would never answer. And so that was just a funny little rumor that spread throughout the organization. A more serious one, I guess, is more like what your friends and family think. You have, in a way, they think that because you work from home in a way you don't work at all, that you have a ton of flexibility. So you'll often hear, oh yeah, let's go get coffee at 2:30 and, then go shopping. And that's not necessarily something that you could do because you do work full time. It's just not in an office. So a lot of that sort of funny, not really sure what it is that you do type of misconceptions.
Or maybe projections or wishful thinking that you can go shopping every afternoon. Sounds nice. How about you, Sandra?
I found that a lot of people wondered what I did before I started teleworking because of prospect research. There's a lot of that mystery. And so I'm not sure about my colleagues because a lot of them, they got what I did, but they may not see the reports or they might not see all the input that I was doing. And so the new boss, what she ended up doing though was started saying, hey, this is how many reports she did and this month when we had a big load, they wanted to make sure that it was recognized that I had put in 700 contact reports. And that was good. That was really good. But I think a lot of people thought I was probably outside getting a suntan and reading a book.
Unless it was snowing.
Yeah.
How about you, Lara? Any misconceptions people have had?
The first thing that comes to mind was when I first started at Juilliard working remotely, there was almost a hesitation to reach out to me as if they didn't want to interrupt what I was doing or something. That was one thing I definitely had to, underline is I'm here, I'm working, I'm sending you your profiles, I'm doing your reporting, I'm definitely here to work. So please reach out to me. So that's one thing I found myself definitely having to ask people. The other thing at Charity, you brought up coffee dates and this misconception that just because you're home, you're not working. I've worked East Coast hours. I'm on the West Coast. And so when I worked for Juilliard and for UNICEF, I worked East Coast hours. So I finished, let's say, at between 2 and 3. So that was, I started at 6 or 7, but in the morning, but I finished pretty early in the afternoon. So that gave me the flexibility to, start my personal life after that. So it doesn't really help support that idea that I'm working all day long if I can meet you at 3 or 4, but Yeah, that was a nice advantage.
Especially with small children. That's
Right.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Perfect timing.
It's nice to be able to pick them up from daycare earlier than later. So
You could actually participate in after-school activities.
right, exactly.
And I've done things like I'll take a half a day or I'll take a day off to take care of my grandkids, but then that means I have to work on Saturday. So I still have to get everything done at some point. So as a last question to kind of wrap things up, if there's other folks out there who want to get a job telecommuting, and I know we've all seen the posts on Prospect L asking questions, how do you present it? How do you find a job like that? Do you have any tips for someone like that about finding a telecommuting job? Did you want to start, Charity?
Sure. I would say, just from my experience looking for organizations who have multiple offices or locations, so now different national nonprofit organizations, or even higher ed institutions or hospitals that have different locations, I think that helps with the possibility of if it's a new remote job, selling it, or if it's a job that someone has been in the position before, they have some experience with that organization wide. That would be my first tip. And then second tip would be to make sure to ask those key questions around, what are the expectations for my work? How often will I have to travel? What are the different technology or equipment or other needs that come with a position like that? Just making sure that you have everything that you need to be a success in that role.
Do you have anything to add to that, Laura? That was pretty good.
It depends if you want to stay with your organization or if you're looking to move. There are even nonprofits now that don't necessarily have a centralized office. So that's something to look for when you're looking for another organization, is that it might be a telecommuting office. So definitely keep your eyes out for that.
It could be a startup kind of nonprofit.
Right. When you're thinking about it and consider your organizational culture, like Charity mentioned, like, do they use Skype for Business? Is WebEx a option? Is there option for video chatting? Are they structurally set up to bring you in on meetings, video versus conference calls? Those are things to explore just structurally to see if it's set up.
Yeah, and I guess too, if you are interviewing with someone and they don't even know what Skype is or WebEx, a big alarm bell there.
Yeah.
That would be a problem. How about you, Sandra? Do you have anything to add to that?
When I lost my job, I didn't know where to even try to find something that was teleworking. And I looked on Prospect L and I actually posted something about it, and nobody really had any input. And I was looking online for different things and I just couldn't find anything that was going to fit. And I had, 10 years experience in prospect research and I loved my job. And so I really wanted to continue that in some way. I put some feelers out with some development officers and I just was not finding anything. And so then when this position opened up, I was so grateful. And actually, it's the best job I've ever had. It's a wonderful place to work. So I feel like I made a great transition, and I would telework again. What started me thinking about it, it was really interesting. Before my husband got a job, he was actually looking for work. I had gone to an APRA conference, and I just happened to sit at a table with 5 other teleworkers, and they were talking about it, and I just kind of tucked it away in my head. And then the next year, I was like, oh, that might work. So it was at an APRA conference that I got the first idea.
Well, that's a great tip as well, Sandra. So if you're headed to like APRA International Conference, emailing out ahead of time to meet up with folks who are telecommuting. What a great place. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
That was Charity Tubalado, Lara Arlan-Wier, and Sandra Kent on telecommuting. Wish you had a community of peers to support you? Join the Early Career Club to connect, innovate, and grow. Visit www.earlycareerclub.com.